Before we start, because not everyone knows you, you're not officially an MDG premium member yet, and you haven't come to a 10X, so a few have shaken your hand. Tell us about your background a little bit.
Sure. So, as I was thinking about just the talk today, I was thinking about my background. So, my first shift, I had kind of had a bit of a career shift where I was focused more at the early part of my career on special liability with insurance. So, if you've seen Aaron Brockovich, it was that type of work in Houston. So, a lot of the special liabilities from breast implant litigation to chemical spills to all the nasty, gross stuff. And so, I shifted over to MedTech, and the first company that I worked for was actually a startup company. And then through that, my mentor at the time, and it was an automated diagnostic hearing test, which we had reimbursement under existing codes, since I'm going to tie it a little bit to the reimbursement story, and had to get new reimbursement codes. So I worked for an early stage company, learned tons. My learning curve just excelled very quickly. And at that time, we had a distribution agreement with a multinational, with Medtronic, and we're looking at them from an acquisition. The partnership didn't go forward in that case. We were acquired by another public company, and so the joke was that they acquired me. So I joined Medtronic and worked in the multinational. So everything from early stage feasibility, product development to the full life cycle management. Did global marketing, product development, customer education, patient experience, all of those types of things from a global perspective. And then later went to Europe because I wanted to work in the region. So I worked in Switzerland and was responsible for the EMEA region for Medtronic, and then later joined Becton Dickinson while I was in Switzerland and shifted to the earlier in the care continuum from a diagnostic standpoint. Um, and then ultimately came back to the US and worked for an early stage company, and we were definitely impacted from the reimbursement. And so currently I have a couple clients that are in early stage companies, everywhere from medtech to life sciences and diagnostics. I also am currently doing a project for the Medical Device Innovation Consortium that I would imagine many of you are familiar with them. If you're not, they have tons of great resources that are available around real world evidence and other digital health and other initiatives. And I also am a mentor at University of Washington, WSU, and an incubator out of Nova Scotia for early stage tech transfer companies. And so help them on their commercialization journey, everything from identifying, the product feature to the go-to-market strategy. And they always will hear from me, follow the money. So I'm happy to be here, share maybe a couple experiences, learn from all of you as well, because I think all of us probably have our stories about the commercialization journey and the importance of following the money.
And if I'm not mistaken, you're an FOM, friend of Marin and Marvin.
Yes, I am a FOM for sure.
Mhm. Okay. Well, any FOM
And
is
I've seen Ross on here before. I saw Ross on a
yeah,
couple calls, and
yeah.
I worked with Ross years ago, and then actually ran into him at the Medical Device Innovation Consortium for annual public forum a couple weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
So it's a small world, and I think it's kind of like the 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon. If you've worked for Medtronic or
Mhm.
BD, I think everyone ends up being connected in the space.
What I especially enjoy about Ross is the ease with which I defeat him in chess. Whereas Borka really, I might take him under a 1400 today, maybe.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Carla, please tell us about when you had a situation where your reimbursement was slashed and how you pivoted.
So we'll do, I was thinking, of course, this is a situation you always want to avoid or hope it doesn't happen and don't know when it's going to. So in my particular situation, just for context, it was in the cardiac space, cardiac monitoring space. I think if everyone's in that space, there's been a lot of movement and it has been slashed and continues to be slashed from a mobile telemetry. So this is all the ECG monitoring that is done everywhere from a Holter, which is pretty archaic technology for up to 24, 48 hours, to the 14-day monitor space, up to event monitors, as well as mobile telemetry. And so that space, I think, has been under scrutiny for years. It's been reduced, the reimbursement from a mobile telemetry. We've also seen a lot of reduction in the therapeutic side and in the intervention as well from an ablation. The company that I had joined was a new company, in the space. There's many of them, iRhythm, Preventus, some of the big companies, Biotel that's now part of Philips, and it's an event monitor, or it's a Holter, extended wear Holter monitor. It's a wearable up to 14 days. And the industry, it was a category 3. So from a category 3 coding, that's typically used by Medicare in the US for emerging technologies, and it's used to monitor the emerging technologies. And we had category 3 pricing for a number of years. Reimbursement was set to about $300. The industry is interesting because most of the players in the industry, it's a service model from a diagnostic technology facility. So they were monitoring, the revenue is generated by the service. The company I was with, Cardiac Insight, was actually a wearable monitor that was innovative in the sense that the physician could put on the monitor, patient came back or mailed back the monitor, the information was downloaded, and the report was generated immediately, whereas others you have to wait for weeks. So everything was going great. Reimbursement was $300 just in Medicare, $600, $700 with some of the private payers, but there was no national coverage determination. And the different MACs, which are the Medicare groups in the different parts of the region, had completely different pricing. So everywhere in California was about $70. To Florida, Texas, and the Southeast region, it was about $300. So the goal was move from a category 3 to a category 1. So that demonstrates it's no longer emerging technology, and then go to a national coverage determination, which is always the goal, just to get rid of, in our particular case, get rid of variable in the variances in reimbursement that range from 70 to 350. So Medicare issued the proposed rule. It looked like the whole industry was going to go from category 3 to 1, have a national coverage determination, $300. Everyone was like, yay, yay. Mergers and acquisitions went forward in the big industry. And then the first week in December, actually, I was in a hotel in Switzerland moving back to the US. Medicare issued their final rule and basically said they were not going to issue a national coverage determination. They were going to take this under review again. And basically, it was left at the administrator pricing. And Novitas, who had historically reimbursed at $300, slashed it and crosswalked it to Holter for $70. So those who were following the industry probably saw companies like iRhythm stock go from 240 and ultimately over time plummet to 60. I was thinking, great, I'm probably going to be out of a job pretty quickly. What am I going to do with no reimbursement? Because in these particular models in the US, it's a bill and buy, or it's a buy and bill model. They buy it, they buy the technology, bill it. And so that's ultimately what happened. And then I can share a little bit on the journey if anyone has any questions first about, that process. And then I'll share a little bit lessons learned and tips, I would say.
Nikki just joined the call, and I'm reflecting on how many times he said, yeah, once you have something like reimbursement get slashed, you watch your stock price just tumble immediately, because investors know that they're really going to hit you. I'm interested to hear the implications of what happened and how you pivoted, Maureen.
Yeah. Who in industry or who on the panel helps makes those decisions? And we often know that the FDA asks for input on their initiatives, but who gives input from industry on CPT codes and reimbursement?
Well, that was also the learning. I know I attended Nick's presentation, so there are more, I think, experts on reimbursement. But, first, once the category 3 is determined, you have to go through a process and provide a lot of the evidence and gather a lot of the evidence that will talk about the importance. And then it typically goes to the American Medical Society, American Medical Association, and the RUC committee. I think that stands for Relative Unit Committee, if I recall correctly. But it goes through a process, and there are different stakeholders, and those stakeholders may be physician groups. They're typically some of the medical directors from some of the MACs, which are the Medicare Administrative Contractor. And, those MACs, typically, I think there's 8 of them now, 7, 8 of them that are typically part of the larger insurance company, but then there's a firewall, and that MAC is negotiating, which we'll talk about the journey and how painful that was, that I had to present to every single MAC. And then you have societies. In this particular case, we had the Heart Rhythm Society, we had the Society of Interventional Cardiologists, so a lot of the stakeholders from a physician group standpoint. Industry can provide some information. We had a lobby group as well. There was at one time a remote monitoring lobby group that was based out of DC, who are also, lobbying on the Hill once a year about different topics. In this particular case, telehealth, digital health, and a lot of these different topics. And then the medical directors, and I'll talk a little bit about when I had to present to 8 medical directors, and it's just no transparency, I would say, across all the different. So it's those different stakeholders. And we'll talk a little bit, because that was really, when I think of the 3 buckets, it was the importance of stakeholder management and identification from the beginning, evidence generation, and commercialization. So those are kind of the 3 buckets that I prepared for the talk today.
Let's launch into it.
Okay, so what ended up happening in our particular case, I thought, all right, well, this is great. We probably already have relationships with some of the societies. We'll lean in on some of the key stakeholders. Well, we had some relationships, but we didn't have tons. So in this particular journey, I think, and then I'm going to generalize the discussion. In this particular case, we ended up really mapping out all of the different stakeholders, thinking about who are the patient groups, who are the physician groups, who are legislators that care about this, who are the physicians our customers in all of these different areas. We ended up having to present, as I mentioned, to 8 MACs. There's, when you end up having this MAC local in the US determination, each of them have authority to determine their own price. And so, of course, we started with Novitas. Novitas is the one that's in the Southeast region. That's actually part of, I think it's GuidePoint, GuideWell. Someone can correct me on the name, but it's it's basically the company that has Blue, and they have integrated cares, but then they have these Medicare administrators. They have First Coast, which is Florida and Puerto Rico, and then Novitas. And these MACs typically have 6 to 8 different states, and they manage the reimbursement for that particular area. So I basically went on a rotation to present to all of them. And the crux of the story was, you've been paying for this for the last, X number of years under category 3. You've gone to a category 1. There's been established data about the impact to the patient. We really needed to have a crisp story about what was the impact to the patient, what was the impact to the healthcare system from an efficiency standpoint. And to that table, I brought customers, because of course they didn't want to hear from industry. They wanted to also hear from our customers. So I brought a customer to each of those presentations in a local region, a customer that was specific to the MAC, and we basically went to all of them. So, you have Noridian, you have CGS, which is Kentucky and Ohio. They're all, completely separate. And the story was about equity and access, because in this particular case, they had taken something that was novel, innovative technology that was reimbursed at $300, up to $700 commercial. And when I sat back and looked at it, it was awful for me, because basically it was walking it over to old technology, the reimbursement, and basically saying it was the same as the Holter after we spent all this time talking about the benefits. And it really became equity, a story about equity and access. And I made comments like, okay, you've got 2 grandmothers, one that's in Florida and one that's in California. Why is it that we give access to the one that's in Florida, that the reimbursement might be higher, access to innovative technology, but then the grandmother that's sitting in Washington State or California might just be prescribed the Holter because the physician doesn't want to deal with it. They don't want to buy the new technology because they can't be reimbursed. So I think it's also thinking about, like, what is the impact of that slashed reimbursement, and who are the individuals that are being hurt most? And typically for me, it's the patients, and it's patients that are not having access to innovative new technology. So with that journey, we had all of the Medicare. I also presented to CMS. CMS has a different groups also with the ops. So, with the ops, pricing is different. And, that was what I referred to Nick on how all the ops pricing works, because it's so completely different world to me. But it was really trying to generate and develop evidence that was creating valuation of the code when you looked at the physician's time and the direct cost to the physicians, and then also, the administrative time to run, it's all the different components of the global. And I don't want to get too technical with the CPT codes, but you have a global component, you have a technical component, and then you have other components that cover the physician hookup. The technical component was the most, but it was astonishing to me because the discussion with the medical directors and the ultimate decisions, the reimbursement was all over the board. And they either, ultimately came to about $300 for the reimbursement, but it still was not regional carrier based. And so when you look at that, how did that impact us commercially? We couldn't hire reps in the regions where the reimbursement was horrible and non-existent. Mm-hmm. The areas where we grew reps, probably that was a lesson learned, grew too quickly, and placing some reps in areas that we were betting on high reimbursement in Florida. And then when it slashed, your sales start going away or shrinking pretty quickly. So it's, you have to manage your books tight, lay off individuals. I think also it impacts fundraising if you're an early stage company because you're not managing the risk associated with the reimbursement. So I think the key takeaway is really thinking about, what is the impact and who are the stakeholders. And the last group that we presented to, two other groups that we presented to were the physician groups. So a lot of the societies.
You said something that's, if I understood you, was new to me. Reimbursement has geographic implications. I thought it was national.
No. So what happens, especially for emerging technologies, so in the case of emerging technologies, and when I talk to the tech transfer teams, I always say follow the money, because strategically either your technology may be reimbursed under existing codes. Mm-hmm. And so this is kind of applicable to many different areas. When you get into, of course, global, completely different process per country and different areas that you need to think about. But you typically will have existing codes, or you may have to go under a new code, and you may make that decision strategically to differentiate from existing codes. So it's really, it's complex in the sense of, where does my technology fit? If it's a Me Too, then there's probably codes that exist. If it's different, then it may fall into, you have to go through the process to get a new code, which is pretty cumbersome and requires expertise in that area. Or there might be categories. So if you look at the digital therapeutics group, for example, digital therapeutics did not have any codes for the longest time. And then now we have codes for some of these areas, and you may have a code, but you don't have the valuation. So just because you have a code doesn't necessarily mean you have the valuation. And then the valuation gets into a process of calculating how much time, what are the direct costs that are associated with that technology, and then coming up with some, and there you can hire different firms. To Marin's question earlier, I think Deloitte was also involved in this particular case, that they were analyzing a lot of the industry. And so you don't, Joe, and then when you're category 3, which is typically done for emerging, it basically looks at the adoption of emerging technologies over time. I think this particular category was a category 3 for like 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. And they were paying at $335 in this region, only in this Novitas and one other area. They weren't paying for it in California and other areas because it did not have a national coverage determination or an NCD. Okay. And so what happens with that is you have to go through, thanks, Nick is showing the map, a Medicare map. So if you look at the United States, you have different of these MACs that are managing the region, and then you have to negotiate. And there's no price transparency many times across these groups. And when we were talking to CMS about this, they realize it. So they were looking at ways also to put together committees, because you could have one MAC in one area, like I said, giving $70, and then the other one giving $300. So there's no transparency in the process. That's why the goal is ultimately to get a national coverage determination. And so what happens in a national coverage determination, once you go to category 1, once you go from this category 3 to category 1, it kind of validates that the technology is being adopted. When you go to, there are some that will argue they don't want a national coverage determination because strategically they may want to have different pricing. Or if you go to a national coverage determination, what it does is it sets the baseline for Medicare.
Mhm.
And so it says, and this is what happened. So after presenting to all of these different stakeholders, I even presented to House of Representatives, to our local Washington representatives about their recipients. I went to AARP. I went to the patient advocacy groups, the physician advocacy groups, had them all write letters when it came to the proposed rule. And in January of this past year, we had a national coverage determination, which was a huge win. Unfortunately, our company had to have a lot of layoffs, but to me, this is a great win. We had a national coverage determination that was $300. And what happens with that is Medicare sets a baseline, and then the payers do a percentage off of the baseline. So the payers, some of them were up to reimbursing up to $600 to $700. So you see Novitas, for example, we had a lot of reps in this particular area.
You taught me something
And
new.
then it gets more complex because one of them, and Nick, maybe you can remind me, Novitas, one of them manages the Indian Health Association.
Mm-hmm.
So, Nick.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, I think it is Novitas, and IHS, the Indian Health Service, and the VA are both.
Yeah.
That's a topic for another day, Joe. That could be something for Mio Tun, that gentleman I introduced you to. But Carla, you're exactly right. Like, the Indian Health Service has a huge budget, and they don't require all the data the other MACs require. They don't have nearly the bureaucracy or the time. I mean, it's an untapped resource to get your product on the market tomorrow. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, and it's and I'll transition to the importance of stakeholder management of really mapping them out. But the Indian Health Services, the VA, exactly what the process was that we had to get under the VA to get the coverage. And then, so let's say you go through the process, you have a, category 3 that's experimental. Then you get this category 1, and then there are all the stakeholders that are involved with the, I was amazed just going through the process with the committee and this calendar of when it goes through. Then you get this category 1 and you get a national coverage determination. You're like, awesome, I'm set. Well, that's great for CMS. Oh yeah, the TSET. We can talk about the TSET too. So when we have category 1 and you have a national coverage determination, you think you're all set. Well, no, because then the private payers have their medical necessity policies. So the private payers in our particular case, and what we did early on to gather data, is we had a team pulling all the EOBs, or the explanation of benefits. So what we did is we partnered and worked with accounts, and we were getting the explanation of benefits the entire time. And we used that data for a couple of reasons. One, to keep our pulse on how much were the commercial payers paying, because again, the rates were all over the board. From Aetna was paying like $250 to we had some other regional payers paying $1,000. And then that plays into your strategy of how do your customers also negotiate their contracts with the payers. So thanks, Nick. I saw that he jumped off. But it's a complex, but it doesn't have to be that complex. I'm not a reimbursement trained person. I spent time in market access, and it was more about how do you drive adoption and access, whether it's in the U.S. or other regions, which then are driven by other decisions on public policy. And I think that if you map out and have an idea of where the reimbursement is, if you don't have a national coverage determination, it is critical to know that, to monitor, have your payer relations, because you're presenting to the payers. We were presenting once a quarter, and we had white papers driving why should they use this adoption, what was the impact to their constituents, what was the impact to their physicians, and trying to break into demonstrating medical necessity. And then a lot of times they may say, okay, well, before you can do this monitor was 14 days, you had to do a Holter. Patient had to wear a Holter, then they wore this for 14 days. We broke down a lot of those barriers where there was not medical necessity for our monitor. And this is something the industry did. It wasn't just our company. but there are medical necessity in particular cases where they have to get approval or do a 14-day monitor, for example, before you do a 30-day monitor. I think there's some questions. I just want to make sure.
No, just the links.
Oh, TSET.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and the
Do you
TSET, I
want to
think
talk about that at all? You want to come on and because you have
we're
an emerging technology, yes?
Oh, me? Yeah. Yeah, so we have a new technology we're developing. It's basically a nerve stimulator to treat obstructive sleep apnea, non-invasive. I don't know if you heard any of that.
Yep, we heard all of it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so we're at early stages. We got FDA breakthrough device designation. And we'll be starting hopefully pivotal trials probably into next year, maybe early year after that. So we're thinking about
By the way, we have a neuroscientist joining us next week.
Fantastic. We love neuroscientists.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and William, I mean, I think what's interesting with that is even that's changing, right? The TSET before, I think, wasn't the rule. If you got the breakthrough technology, then you got the reimbursement, but now they've just made some recent changes.
That's right.
You'll only go through a review. Yeah, do you recall off the top of your head the change?
I think they formed the TSET as the change. So I think it's a little broader than, so it's not automatic anymore, but I think it's also a little bit broader. I'm not an expert on it. We had a talk on it a month and a half, 2 months ago.
Yeah, it's broader, but I think also, if I recall from the annual public forum that I went to from MDIC, there was a discussion about CMS will only review so many per year. And because they are delayed, it's still not a necessarily easy win once you have that coverage determination. And in that particular case, I think the importance is thinking about what is the duration and the coverage, because you don't want to get into a situation that it disappears after that duration of time expires. And so, for example, there's a group that I'm working with. They've had coverage 3 and they're going to category 1. So right now, they plan full launch January 1st with category 1. And I said to them, okay, guys, get all of that ready. You have to get that all ready, but you have to monitor all the comments that are being made in the proposed rule as you shift to the final rule coming December, because I was just telling them, you don't want to be in that situation that you're about to launch, you're banking on funding, you're doing all of this, and then Medicare says, sorry, we made a decision to extend this another year. And I think that's really the important thing. Go ahead, William.
No, that was it. So we have some time, so we're trying to plan ahead. And so if it does sound like a long process, but if we've got the time and it's a worthwhile process, then we would absolutely consider it. But still,
for you, I think that's great. Yeah, I think for you that's great. This was another company that I was mentioning. It's going from 3 to 1, and then they'll go January 1st. I think just one comment I wanted to say also just about the stakeholder management. I think that's the other reason it's so important up front, and we had gaps in this particular case when I joined this particular company. But I like to always spend time up front with the stakeholder management, and that to me includes your patient groups who are advocates, your customer physician groups, your customers, of course, CMS, your legislators. I was contacting the Indian Health Services. I was contacting, as I mentioned, the legislators. I was contacting AARP because they were, if we were going to slash reimbursement for a Medicare population, they should know this from their constituents. And the reason I was contacting them is to create an American Heart Association. I was doing this to make them aware of the situation, that we were blocking, that this decision was blocking access to innovation and technology and better diagnostics, and to garner their support that during the proposed rule period, that's when anyone can comment. Anyone can comment on the rules. So basically, we were creating template letters that the physicians could use or modify and asking them to put a comment on the proposed rule, where the proposed rule was saying it was going to be carrier-based.
It'd be interesting to know how successful that campaign was. It sounds like
it was.
It was.
Yeah, it was very successful and others did that too. iRhythm, others did that. And I'm always monitoring. I always tell teams, monitor. It is so interesting in the proposed rule period. because you can learn a lot about your competitors. You can learn a lot about who is positioning what, and then the stakeholders. And we also garnered support from Stop AF, the Stop Atrial Fibrillation Patient Advocacy Group, because this was detrimental. And then we also garnered support from the Heart Rhythm Society. And that's why it's building credible relationships. And I always tell people I use that 4 box, of, where does my stakeholder fall from a power and influence, and then their interest level. And so if, I'm happy to share that graph if you guys haven't used that box before, but it's really stakeholder management from, do I manage them closely? Do I keep them informed? Do I monitor them? And it's really thinking about your stakeholders along your journey early.
I'd like to see that. Michelle, you have a comment? Oh, and you have a kitty in a cone?
What?
Don't you have a pet in a cone?
Yeah, and I'm not going to talk about it.
Okay.
It's not appropriate. What's wrong with him?
Oh,
So I had and I apologize. I had to step out to get his medicine. So you might have covered this, but I came in on the end of the breakthrough in CMS, and I have customers all the time want me to put in breakthrough device designations for them because they're convinced that a couple of things. First, that CMS is going to come to their pre-sub meeting with the FDA and help them make a clinical study plan from the very start. And second, that they're going to immediately have CMS coverage once they get their clearance or grant or PMA or whatever.
also never happens.
Yes. And so, like, if I could just get a very clear and articulate statement that Joe could cut out of this video, and I could say, here, listen to Carla.
Okay, Carla, can you do a 1-minute promo about what they need to understand? Starting now. No pressure.
You know what? I'm going to have to come back to that, Michelle, because I think it's on the TSET, it's a completely different approach for that emerging versus existing. So maybe can we just get together offline? I know that's on the spot, but it depends on what type of technology also. Is it medical device? Is it digital therapeutics? What is it?
It's all medical devices, but digital health falls underneath medical device as well.
Yes, but is it digital? Is it a digital therapeutic, or is it a digital health or digital medicine? Like, what is the component of the digital aspect?
Let's just say medical devices as a whole. CDRH regulated devices.
Okay. I probably don't know if I can give you one on the spot right now, just because there's so much that's being shifted, as you see right now with the digital health aspect and reimbursement. I mean, just when I was at the annual public forum, Jeff Sheeran from the FDA was there with his whole staff about digital health. So I'm going to refrain because I don't think I need some more coffee and sit down and think about it. So let's connect afterwards, because I think maybe the two of us and your expertise in the regulatory breakthrough, we could put something together and share it with the group.
You have one another's contact information? Or shall I?
No, Michelle, can you put your contact? I think we might be connected on LinkedIn, or I'll find you. But if you can put it in the chat, that would be great.
I'll put our email in the chat for everyone.
So I know we're running on time. One of the I would say 2 other areas. Oh yeah, that's okay, great. 2 other things, the stakeholder to me is critical upfront. I always spend time with the stakeholder. A lot of times they're just running after who are the KOLs, what are they doing? And this is also such the importance to get those customers as your advocates. In this particular process, the impact that we had to commercialization, we also had a sales team that was selling on how much money are you going to make by using this technology, which is dangerous and awful, versus what is the clinical impact? What is the impact to efficiencies of the delivery of care? How do you hook your customers so that when reimbursement goes away, they're not that likely just to shut the door on you? So it's also thinking about how does all of this impact your customer acquisition and your customer retention? Because if your sales go away, you have no money, you can't pay your employees, all these other challenges that present themselves, and also impact your growth. If you're trying to get Series A. So this definitely stalled some of the investment because of the reimbursement strategy. I think when you strategically think about, as an early company, those sales, it's always about going after that low hanging fruit, which might be, in our particular case, it was private clinics and or small cardiology practices or some primary care physicians in rural areas. But it's critical, even though the sales process is longer, to have some of those key opinion leaders who are also advocating for the advanced innovative technology, because those are the people that you call on, you know, if SH hits the fan and you're trying to garner support for innovative technology. And then I also say, everyone, I'm known to say, follow the non-customers, because so many times we go after our customers, but always understanding the voice of the non-customer, whether that comes from product development to other areas from adoption perspective.
Non-customers because they potentially could be, but you're not satisfying their needs, and figure out
Yeah,
why.
exactly. Yeah, everything from a product development. You know, I remember even at Medtronic, I was hired to actually join Medtronic to do a nerve integrity monitor. So, William, I'm interested what you're doing. But in the lab, we always had all of our customers, all these KOLs that were KOLs for years and years and years. And so I really tried to break down that mindset and bring in our non-customers. You know, who was buying the Stryker equipment? Who was buying why were they buying that equipment from others? And because what needs were not being met. So, you know, that group is in stakeholder management as well. You know, how do I
In
manage?
general, that sales folks are giving that information back to you when they are unsuccessful in converting or getting someone to come on. They get a good sense of what the objections are. I mean, that's really what you're mining for.
Hopefully, if they're following, if you've got a good CRM that you can gather these statistics and measure that. But yeah, also getting that feedback from your salespeople for sure.
You talked earlier about how it switched from category 3 to 1. In general, isn't category 1 reimbursed at a higher rate in general? Isn't that typically a good thing?
I don't know across the board. I mean, I think that it's more stable. I don't know if others can opine on this, but typically in my experience, what I've seen, it's been more stable. It doesn't necessarily mean it's higher. In our particular case, you know, the extended wear monitor, it used to be reimbursed at $320, and then when we got category 1 finally in January of this year, I think it's around $250.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So Joe, are you thinking category 3 as in FDA code, more complex, higher risk? Or because the CPT codes don't necessarily correspond with that.
No.
So what type of category 3 are you thinking?
I was talking about reimbursement, and that, as I understand it, that, you know, by virtue of the fact that category 1 is established, there's a number out there, and category 3 could be a bit more nebulous, and, you know, it's not set. And I would think that something that's established would be higher in general. But
yeah, I don't know. I would have to ask. It'd be interesting to look at that data point maybe over the last 5 to 10 years, and what the category of reimbursement, you know, what is it that we're reimbursing?
mm-hmm.
In our particular case, like I was mentioning, we had Novitas that you showed that map. They were reimbursing $330. Noridian was reimbursing $70, and then we landed with a category 1 at $250. So
the other thing is that since category 3s are not widely used by definition, they don't have established RVUs, and so there's no payment rate established for them yet.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another complexity. And, you know, I think what we ended up doing is we put together our strategy. I had a person that was more of a payer relation kind of EOB analysis to understand the dollars. And then
EOB?
We put together our strategies. Pardon me?
EOB?
Explanation of benefits. So we were gathering all the explanation of benefits, which is basically, you know, the physician bills, so it submits to the insurance company, and then we knew what they were paying. So of course it's de-identified. We, you know, the clinics definitely will get rid of the patient information so that we could gather information. And it was helpful for them too, to see how much their different payers were paying. So when they were getting into the practices were getting into negotiations with their payers, they were saying, like, Aetna, why are you giving us $250 when this other payer over here is giving us $700? So that's where you see the inequities, which is a whole other banter another time. The inequities in the healthcare system, you know, in the US depending on insurance, access, all of these different things. And as Nick mentioned, also with the Indian Health, we were tapping into the Indian Health services because it is a huge population that has heart problems. And so they were key stakeholders also from a reimbursement. I'm going to shift, I think, just to one category. I touched on, when you think about it, how do you avoid these situations? And when given a curved ball, what do you do from a reimbursement standpoint? I think it's important to map out, as I mentioned, the stakeholder groups, looking at the advocates, starting with the patients, the customers, physician societies, those other types of groups that you can lean on. And then, strategically risk management across the board from a commercialization. And then the least, and I would say it's not the least important, it's probably the most important, is a strong evidence generation strategy from day one. And it doesn't have to be a random controlled clinical trial in some cases, it can just be use cases. But how are you gathering all of that information that you would be using anyways from a regulatory submission and thinking about it for the FDA, but how do you also use that information to ultimately to drive coverage, reimbursement decisions and amounts, pilots that you might do with some of the small regional carriers? That's a great opportunity. There's lots of carriers out there that you can do pilots with to demonstrate what is the impact to their patients, what is the impact to, Free Spira here in Kirkland is a good example. If you wanted to ever have them present, I don't know if they've presented, but they have a PTSD digital therapeutic, and they did a partnership with Highmark and a couple other groups where they were able to look at, what patients were presenting at urgent care, how many people were having anxiety or PTSD related episodes, and through their technology, they were able to decrease the number of visits to the urgent care. So I always tell teams, think about what is the evidence that you're going to need, not only for FDA, but how are you going to use that to go to the payers? Do not wait till you get the FDA approval and then say, oh, I should go talk to the payers now. I wonder what the payer is going to reimburse me, because that might take another 2-year process. Mm-hmm. And that evidence, and I'm probably super biased on this, it needs to start with the patient. And I think, we'll see more. I was talking to Joe, there's so much going on around the patient preference information where the FDA is utilizing that patient preference information. What will a patient choose if given the options of the different technologies? And I think that would be a great talk at a future session. But now there's a gap between the FDA is looking at patient preference, but how is CMS and how are the payers looking at patient preference information? And so it's really thinking about patient engagement, patient reported outcomes, patient preference information, which is very different than some of these other areas, and developing your strategy of how are you going to collect that data to present to the different stakeholders. Is anyone using patient preference information that's on the call actually, or collecting that data?
No, it doesn't seem so presently. I don't think so.
There's lots of great information. If you Google patient preference information, the FDA website is fantastic. I'll find the link while we're chatting. They've got tons of information. I'm working on, and I'll definitely keep the team apprised of the situation or of the videos. I'm working with a medical device innovation consortium actually to put together some educational videos around patient preference information. I think it's huge, and it's everything from, if you are bringing a digital app that's a wound care or a diagnostic of a skin dermatology device, for example, looking at what was the information that you generated of efficacy and how it's utilized to represent a diverse patient population. So how is that going to work on a Caucasian skin? How is that going to work on African-American skin? Because a lot of times, just like we saw with trials for clinical, we do not use a diverse population. And it is critical that we think about those patients in diverse groups and how they will utilize our technology and or adopt it. And how do they prefer it? We never really talk to them about what does the patient prefer. We think that this great new digital app on the phone is going to be awesome. But does that 80-year-old person that lives in a rural area that doesn't have 5G or may not even have a phone, what is their preference for technology and delivery of care?
Or have you ever had clients in the orthopedic space?
In what area of orthopedics? I mean, I worked with Medtronic spine and some of those areas. So we had orthopedic more on the spine side. What area are you thinking,
Just my
Joe?
buddy Tiger here is all about ortho all the time. And I just wondered if there might be some insights or benefits of the two of you talking.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to explore what the needs are. I mean, for me, I look at a lot of the same methodologies and processes are applied regardless of the technology.
Eddie, I suspected when you turned your camera on, you had something to add.
Yeah, I had to run and get something, and Carla, I'm based in the UK. We're developing devices for urinary control, which are quite unusual compared with what the current standard of care is. So when you started mentioning about patient preference information, that's something I'd really be interested in talking about. In fact, I've got a call starting literally in 10 minutes with my chairman and somebody about this sort of topic. So yeah, is that something that's helpful? Because again, with a new technology, we're looking at having this priced technically at a premium to the cost of current devices. But as we gather the data that we think we will be able to demonstrate lower incidence of infections and all the associated health economics with that, that's where we think we're actually overall not only cost competitive, but also something we think patients would prefer.
Well, I can share with you also, Edward, because the NICE guidelines, NICE seems to be all about getting that patient information, and the
It absolutely
guidelines
is,
in the UK, and I would say Europe and some of these groups on the patient preferences are ahead. If you even think of tender management in the US outside the US, being able to demonstrate value to patients and to the healthcare system, I think started a lot with the tenders in that area. So I just put my email in the chat. Happy to talk to you about that and point to a couple resources on it. Like I mentioned, you have ISOR. There's a couple different groups that I can point you to as well, because depending on where you're going, if you're going to the European market first, or if you're coming to the US, there's different areas and there's different talks. Global?
Yeah, with MDR, it's all a bit of, we're actually kind of running a parallel process. So
okay. All right, great. Yeah, I'm happy to share that. It's an exciting area, the patient preference information. It's different than the patient engagement. The group that I'm working with is very focused on what is patient preference information for the regulatory landscape as well as for market access. So there's definitely some resources and videos, and take a look at MDIC that I mentioned as well, patient preference. They've got tons of resources there, but we can chat for sure.
I know you have this already, but just to remind you, I gave you Anne's email address if you want to reach out and explore her availability. In closing, I'm hoping this might be a putting you on the spot thing. When I think the folks were excited about today's talk because they wanted to take away, if I'm working on a product and reimbursement is slashed, what's the best path, how best to pivot? You talked about a lot. I would personally find it challenging to summarize what you said in a meaningful way. Are you able to do that for like top takeaway? If that happens to you, what?
So top takeaway is assess and identify your stakeholder management and who can be the partners to help support and be advocates. Develop your evidence, have strong evidence of the value to the patient and the healthcare delivery system, and then really pivot and think about your commercialization strategy and risk management there.
Okay, thank you. Next week we have John Wainwright. He is a PhD neuroscientist. He's a lecturer and has a VP role at a neuroscience company. I think that'll be interesting. And Carl, I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone. Thank you, and we hope to get to meet you in person in May. So,
in May, I hope it was helpful. Please reach out, and happy to share resources.
And you and Michelle, I know, will be doing exactly that. Tiger, will we talk later today? Yes, okay. Be well, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take this Halloween. Bye.